Hello, thank you for coming to my interview. We can start. So, the first question is: what attitudes towards climate change in England do you observe?
Thank you for having me, Constantia. In England, we have a big range of attitudes towards climate change. There are lots of people who are very worried, and there are lots of people who are very passionate about trying to help reduce and stop fossil fuels and emissions that are causing climate change. There's also a lot of people who I think there's a lot of people who ignore it and who think it doesn't matter, or are worried but don't feel like they can do anything. And there is unfortunately quite a few people who either don't believe or don't care about climate change, and often unfortunately the people like that tend to be the ones in power. So the latest government, or the government that's been in the UK for some time but has changed a lot over the last few years, is currently going back against some of the commitments that they made, because they think they can get more votes by not pushing as hard on climate change adaptation.
Okay, so that do these attitudes differ between social groups? Is there a social group which is more active or less active?
Yes, definitely. I would say it's more political than the political groups.
Okay.
Certainly the older generation are who are the ones in power, are a lot, as a general, obviously lots of individuals are different, but generally I think the older generation are not as worried. There's a lot of anxiety within the younger generation, and there's a lot of people in power who are the older generation, and they want to keep things the same way because that has benefited them over time.
So, has this changed over the years, or do you observe any change?
I mean, we've certainly seen a lot of change in the UK over over a number of years. So the UK has often been very good, actually. So the UK has had lots of very passionate people campaigning about climate change for a long time. So 10, 15 years ago, there was activist groups, lots of activist groups who started up. One of them was called the Camp for Climate Action, where they would do big protest camps outside Heathrow Airport, and protesting against the third runway. And they protested against new coal-fired power stations, and they actually stopped new power stations being built. Then you had Extinction Rebellion came through in 2018, and they shut down all the bridges in London. And actually, at that point, that was after the Paris Agreement from 2015. And Extinction Rebellion did a big protest in London for a week, and they shut down all the bridges in London. And in that, a few months after that, Theresa May, who was a Conservative Prime Minister, actually enshrined into law a thing called the Climate Emergency kind of Act. But basically, she enshrined the Net Zero Act, actually, which legally committed the UK to reducing its carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. So because of a lot of very passionate people doing protests and putting themselves in the way and putting themselves in danger, it made the government, it pushed the government into signing up to one of the world's first net zero by 2050 in law agreements. And ever since then, unfortunately, the UK has done some really good stuff, but over the last 4 or 5 years maybe, the UK has kind of turned around, and some of the good policies they put in place, they've started to backtrack on. So the UK has had, so we've had lots of different attitudes, but there is, we've had a lot of, and right now we have Just Stop Oil, which is another campaign group that came out of Extinction Rebellion. So there's lots of very passionate people who are doing lots of very good stuff. There are lots of people who seem to be sticking their heads in the sand and like to keep things the way they are because they're making money out of it. And there's a lot of people in the middle who either don't know what to do or are trying to ignore it because it's too scary to think about.
Okay, so what can be done to mobilize these passive people?
So yeah, I mean, I think climate change has become much more over the last 4 or 5 years because we've seen a lot of climate changes and the temperature is going up, and we've seen lots of flooding in the UK. We see droughts that affect our farmers and our crops. So I think people are starting to wake up and realise that it's not something that's going to happen in 20 years' time. It's happening now. So climate change has become much more of a political agenda than it has been before. And for the first, we have an election coming up probably next January, or somewhere between now and next January. And for the first time ever, it's expected that climate change will play a key part in the election conversations. So in terms of mobilising more passive people, I think bringing it more into the conversation, into the discussions. The other thing I always say is that I'm a techno optimist, what they call a techno optimist, in that I think we have the technology if to stop climate change or reduce the impacts of climate change. So we've already managed to globally reduce the projected increases from 6 degrees down to 3 degrees in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And actually, if we keep bringing more technology in, renewable energy, solar panels, wind power, electric vehicles, new forms of regenerative farming, there's lots of solutions now. So, but what's happened over the last maybe 5 years is that a lot of these technologies are becoming cheaper and better than the alternatives. So nowadays, an electric car it's about as expensive as a normal car, but it's much more better for the environment. It's much better it costs much less to drive. So from moving the passive people forward, it's more a case of making the green alternative more attractive for normal consumers. If that makes sense.
And how can we support people who are already active?
There's a whole lot of ways you can do that. People who are there's lots of different types of activism. So you have things like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. So if you felt like you wanted to get involved, you can donate. I do monthly donations to Greenpeace, for example. So that's kind of financially supporting them. Obviously, if there are things like protests, if there are things that people do to be more active, then supporting them on social media, supporting them on news articles, things like that. That's really good as well. Just showing that there's, unfortunately or fortunately, the democracy works in terms of opinion. So if the governments of the day see that people want to see more green action, then by supporting the active people, you are actively showing the governments that they should be changing quicker. You can also join political parties. So I'm a member of the Green Party, which is a political party in the UK which campaigns for more green solutions and has one green MP. Hopefully have more green MPs in the next election. So that's the main one in terms of supporting activism.
What emotions can be seen in your country regarding climate change? Because there is a range of attitudes, and what about emotions?
I think, emotions, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of people who are very worried and very upset and feel very helpless. And the more you learn about the science, the scarier it can get. And the news is very scary because we always know the news is. But the news has a very negative bias. So the news only talks about negative things because that's what people will watch. So I think there's a lot of people who do that, and a lot of people, and therefore the advice to a lot of those people is to get involved, be more active, do more good things, do stuff yourself, get renewable energy, fly less, take the train more, buy organic food, all that kind of stuff. And then there's a lot of people on the other end who are very angry and who are very anti what they call woke or left or liberal, and they see it as a political philosophy. and they get very angry about it because it's been turned into a scary thing that's affecting their lifestyles and affecting their liberties. Personally, I think a lot of that is just fear mongering, and it's just campaigns by fossil fuel companies who want to keep things the same, who don't want change to happen. So yeah, there's a lot of different emotions, from kind of very angry people who don't believe in climate change, all the way through to people who are worried and scared about what the future brings.
Okay. So about the future, what do you think would happen if the pessimistic scenarios would occur? People would be more prone to collaboration, or would it turn into this, as you said, political thing? And are there, for example, some works related to, let's say, like emergency law for like climate related?
I mean, no, there's no such thing at the moment around emergency laws, but there are obviously emergency provisions for emergencies that you could argue are because of climate change. So, for example, if there is massive flooding because there's so much rain, then obviously there needs to be plans in place to support people if their houses get flooded. So there are kind of emergency plans and stuff in terms of place like that. In terms of the pessimistic scenarios, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. It's temperatures are already rising, and we're already seeing extremes of weather, and that's a challenge. So we are seeing extremes of heat, and then so we have very dry summers, and then we see very wet winters, and we see lots of rain. Obviously, if the worst case scenario happens and things like the ice sheets in Greenland start melting a lot quicker than they are, then sea levels will rise and cities will flood. So the very worst pessimistic stuff is society starts to break down. And you have what we're already seeing, which is wars, you see pandemics, and what happens is more and more of them come quicker and quicker, and governments and society struggle to maintain structures because they haven't got any money, they haven't got any energy, it keeps happening. So that's the very pessimistic end. The other end is that actually the more positive view is that as people start to see that these things start to affect them, it's not just happening in some developing country far away, it's actually impacting them and their lifestyles and the food on their table and their jobs and how they get moved around and can they get and their house prices and insurance prices. People will start to pay more attention, start to demand more action on climate change. And action on climate change is stopping fossil fuels, is stopping reducing emissions, but it's also creating more resilient forms of growing food. It's creating more resilient communities that look after each other. It's developing more nature, which is what I do for a job, which is buying up farms that shouldn't be farmed because the soil is so bad anyway, and restoring nature on those farms so that we can protect nature as things start to change. It's renewable energy, and it's local communities getting together and then putting their own renewable energy. So there's two extremes. There's the pessimism, and then there's the optimism. And I actually try and be really optimistic about it, because I think we're seeing the technological changes happening, and renewable energy, for example, is now cheaper to install than fossil fuels. So it makes sense economically to invest in renewable energy over fossil fuels. So there you will start to see more and more renewable energy coming on. And then I believe that as the older generations move out of power, they retire, they die, and younger generations come through who are more worried about what's happening and have longer to deal with it, I believe we'll start to see more and more positive policies and scenarios and more people in power who understand what's happening and will make the necessary changes.
Okay, so we were talking a little bit already about the mental health of people. So are there some other phenomena regarding mental health in the context of climate change? Or do you think we've discussed all the ranges of behaviors?
I mean, I think so. I think it's what else? So mental health is a challenging one because it's scary, frankly. And the more you think about it, the more you know about it, the harder it is to deal with because it is scary. But it's like anything. There is a range of emotions to be had. I think supporting people's mental health is really important. I think certainly what I do with my career is we try and work on projects that provide hope. Because if you can show, certainly with nature, if you can show that nature returns and gets better, it's not just a destruction thing.
Okay.
That you can create projects and stories of hope, I think that really helps people. And certainly I try and focus on positive news over negative news to give myself a sort of mental support, really.
Okay, so would you say that this hope is the tool for people who are very active? Because I think that sometimes when we get more active and we try to change things and we are in an environment where people don't care, it can be very demotivating. So would you say the hope is the factor that can help in this case?
Yeah, I think hope is the only thing that we are humans, and to be alive is to have hope. So I think hope is the driving factor. I mean, if you think of all of the activists who do all the stuff they do, from gluing themselves to a road to campaigning, political activists, they are still activists, to all the people who are working on renewable energy technologies and new food production and regenerative farming, everyone has hope, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. You wouldn't do it if you didn't think we could help change things.
Okay.
So for me, hope is the driving factor, and it's why we have millions and millions of people across the world now working on this problem. And as a society and humanity, we have to hope that we can collectively come together and find some solutions and start to mitigate some of the worst parts of what could potentially be quite a scary future.
Okay. So you said that younger people are more worried. So would you say this is the social group which is at highest risk regarding mental health problems?
I think so. I think young people in general are much more aware of their mental health nowadays. I think it's very good because they're much more aware of their emotions and are much more able to communicate. It does unfortunately feel like younger generations have more mental health issues than older generations, but I actually just think it's because older generations haven't really been taught to talk about it. So there's probably the same amount of mental health. It's just if you're in an older generation, you never really learn to talk about it. So I think it's really healthy that the younger generations can talk about it. I think, yes, it's harder because when you're young, as a generational thing, you have less power. You don't have money, you don't have stable jobs, you aren't in a position to make as much change. So I think it's a scary time, and obviously, your generation has had it quite tough. You grew up after the recession in 2008, and then we had a pandemic, and now we've got a war in Europe, and it's tough, right? It's kind of relentless. So I think, and then you're coming out to a struggling economy, house prices are really high. There's so many different challenges around being a young person, but because you're also a generation, you've got the opportunity to make a change, and you've got long time to get into power, and you can do things, you can make changes and stuff. So I think that's the key thing to focus on with this generation.
Okay, so how can we learn to function with the constant changes, as you said, that now it's such an uncertain time regarding climate change, and also, as you said, that there was pandemic and things like that?
Yeah, I think you have to build up your resilience. I think you have to understand how the world is and how the world could be, and work out your circle of influence. Understand what it is that you can change and you can make a difference in, and understand what things are out of your control, and you focus on the things you can change. And you can change your own habits and your own lifestyle and what you do for your job and your career, but you can't necessarily change. There's nothing you can do about climate change, and you can't do anything about a war in Ukraine. All you can do is be aware and work on which areas you can you can do good things in.
Okay.
And I think that's the best way to look at it is what can I control and what can I make a change in? And then over time, if you do things and you make changes and you do positive stuff, you'll find that your circle of control expands and you'll have more opportunities and more power to make bigger and bigger changes.
Okay.
And if everyone did that, then actually you'd end up with a lot of people doing a lot of very positive things.
Okay. So now, do you observe any differences between England and Poland and our region of Europe? Could you say something about this?
Interesting. So differences between England and Poland. So it's interesting because obviously Poland's been going through a bit of a change recently. So you've changed your politics. So I think actually for the last 10 years maybe, we've both had quite right-wing governments, right-leaning governments, and Conservatives in the UK and PiS in Poland. And I think these governments are very traditionalist and they are very, they create a lot of fear in order to keep power. And they make other people, other groups of people be the scapegoats. And they say it's because of the immigrants or it's because of people of a different race or a religion or da, 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 da. And then I think, so actually I think there's been a lot of similarities. I think in the UK, now again, it's interesting, we had a Conservative government in the 80s, which was led by Margaret Thatcher. And in the UK at that point, we were a very coal-heavy country. We used a lot of coal, and the coal miners were really big, and the coal mining unions were really big. Now, I don't know whether it's a good thing or not, to be honest, but actually the Conservative government at the time went against the unions and closed down a lot of the coal mines, and it was socially seen as a very negative thing. But what it meant was that and then we nationalised a lot of our, privatised a lot of our energy companies, which again, maybe not a good thing. But what happened is that we don't have as much, like the energy is not so much of a political, social thing. It's still a challenging thing, but I suppose there's less power of the unions in the UK than there are in Poland. So Poland, you've got big coal mining areas, rural areas, lots of coal. Poland is one of the last holdouts of coal in the UK. Sorry, in Europe. So Poland has a lot of coal-fired power stations. You produce a lot of coal, and the previous government didn't really do much to stop that. And I think you will see now that you've got a more liberal left-wing government, you'll start to see a lot more drive towards shutting down the coal-fired power stations in Poland. Obviously, socially, there'll be a lot of changes that come with that because there's lots of communities that rely on this, but they will have to change. And I think you'll start to see more of a change. In the UK, we've actually done very well with closing our coal-fired power stations. It hasn't become a big political drama because everyone's realised that it's a good thing. And we've actually got a lot of wind power in the North Sea. So one of our success stories in the UK has been to drive the national electricity grid is something like 40-50% of it is renewable now.
Okay.
And I think you'll see the same thing happen in Poland over the next few years, hopefully. We'll start to see a lot more renewable energy, a lot more support for renewable systems. And when people start to realise that actually it makes the air cleaner and it's a lot nicer and it's cheaper eventually than the current systems, and we don't have to rely on gas from Russia, then I think you'll start to see a lot more positive stuff happening in that respect. But there will be some political, emotional changes for a lot of people who have grown up and survive in these communities that are based on fossil fuels.
Okay, but would you say that Poland and England is on different levels of awareness? And
I think so. I would say, I don't know as much about Poland. I think in the UK, certainly over the last 3-4 years, everyone has become very aware. Even if they don't agree, they have an opinion on it. I think Poland is maybe some years behind that because the previous government didn't really care and didn't really talk about it. So I think in Poland you're maybe catching up on the kind of awareness of the challenges around climate change. But you're also part of Europe, which has some quite good policies. So I think Poland will be pushed along maybe a bit faster.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. And what would you say about psychology in the context of climate change? Because think that it is, I think it is a more new area, especially in Poland, and there are a few people who are dealing with that in Poland. How is it in Britain?
Well, I don't know. I don't have that much experience, obviously. So I think I assume that there will be, as you become more and more aware as a country, there'll be more and more people who start to get worried. And from a psychological point of view, there'll be more and more people who need help. And I think that's something the UK has maybe been dealing with for some time. And it's becoming more and more important and more like mainstream to talk about worries about climate change and the future. So I would guess that Poland will need to have more and more psychological support and more mental health people aware of those kind of challenges.
So, are there any support models for people who experience some kind of mental health problems regarding climate change in England?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think there are. I don't think there are additional. There are certainly organisations like Force of Nature I've told you about, who are specifically set up to help young people and advise young people on dealing with climate anxiety through the lens of getting active. So it's kind of there are organisations that have been set up to help young people and help people who newly discover the challenges around the future. And I think that's how they do it. It's kind of get people more active, get people more engaged, give them the tools mentally and emotionally and the skills to understand how to go and make a change. Because as soon as you start doing something positive, then you can see a future that is positive.
Thank
That makes
you.
sense.